going to get started in this first session of the afternoon on equity in transportation. Right now I'm going to introduce our panelists. First is Sarita Turner. She has more than 20 years experience in the nonprofit sector, raising awareness around and supporting strategies to address institutional racism and the disinvestment of people and communities of color. She's Associate Director for Policy Link, where she works to further equity-focused federal, state, and local policies based on place-based strategies. Also, Scot Spencer. He's Associate Director of Advocacy and Influence at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. He leads the Foundation's work in advancing communities-focused policies, practices, and strategies that increase opportunities for children, families, and places where they live and to foster their success. He was a transportation specialist at the Environmental Defense Fund. Please welcome Scot and Sarita.
Oh, great. Thank you, Terence, and thanks, everyone, and thanks for having us here. As Terence mentioned, my name is Scot Spencer. I'm with the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm making sure this is correct. Okay. And for those of you who only know Annie E. Casey by NPR, the foundation actually is a national foundation. We were founded in 1948, and we actually work on a range of policy system reforms and then some place-based work. Really, the primary focus is to improve conditions for America's children and families, and we've expanded that to communities. And my work has pretty much been in the community realm for the past couple of years, working in both of our hometown sites in Baltimore and Atlanta. I wanted to talk to you today, and I guess my part of my job is sort of the primer on what is equity or what is not equity in certain cases, and so I'm going to give that information to you in a few minutes. And I will say that Emiko was really great in sort of teeing up lots of parts of this conversation. Sarita and I were sitting there sort of nodding back and forth to each other like, I said, oh, we can strike that from our remarks. We can strike that one from our remarks, because she covered a lot of some aspects of it, but we want to go into a couple of things probably with a little bit more depth. And so one of the things I wanted to start with is sort of where inequity rests, or how we've come to a place of inequity. And you know, there are some root causes to inequity issues in the United States. And one of the things that I really want to point out is and speak to are the issues of systems failure and structural racism. And you know, I know there are lots of times when you see the word racism and there's automatically this throwback in the audience that I am not this and I am not that. I know Sarita in her presentation, she's got a slide that actually shows what I consider you know, what you can point to what structural racism looks like in the United States in one form or another. And it'll be a picture that you'll see of the city of Baltimore, the city where I live, and that's what the left side of this picture actually points out. But what it was the redlining map from 1936, 1937 by the Federal Home Loan Bank. And as you look at it later on, 80 years later, if you overlay the lines of that red line map of those policies, you can actually see it in how families, communities, children fare or don't fare, even to the point where Emiko was talking about zip code destiny, because in some of those red line areas, life expectancies can be as much as 20 years different than they are in green line areas. And so that's one way it really plays itself out in some of the decisions we make. And I would venture to say, since we're talking about transportation and to put it into transportation parlance, a lot of the impacts, and I'll show you a slide of it later, of the Interstate Highway Act actually play into sort of structural racism and structural issues of structural and institutional racism in the United States. And then when we talk about systems failure, it is really the inability of systems to find a way to respond or react to the shortcomings that might exist as a result of some of these policies and procedures that are put in place. But even worse than that in certain cases, and I'm going to put this one in transportation language because it's something that really, it always annoys me. As a person who had been a transportation advocate at one point, there is nothing that bothers me more than code speak about things that really point to inequities. Actually, I think Miko used the word. She talked about investments, and we always invest in highways, we invest in airports, we invest in this, but then we subsidize transit. It automatically sets up a them and us type of conversation that usually ends up with those of us who are on the transit side on the losing end of the stick, because it's hard to fight the word subsidy. If we were to flip the conversation in another direction, there are some people in the United States that say we have an affordability housing crisis. The fact of the matter is that in the United States we spend about $170 billion a year on the mortgage interest tax deduction. We spend about $7 billion a year on affordable housing. We could solve the affordable housing crisis in a minute if we started to balance out or reduce the inequities between the investment in our mortgage interest tax deduction and put it toward more affordable housing. That's an example of inequities and systems and policy that have taken place in the United States, and that's some of the stuff that we actually work to try to change. It's also important to know that, as it says here, well, no, wrong slide, but that part of our issue with inequity is in how we do or do not acknowledge it. As I said, the Federal Home Loan Act, the Interstate Highway Act, those were policies that were created in the 50s, well, the 30s and the 50s. But if you were impacted by them, they have a long shadow of history. That when you invite people to meetings, when you invite people to come to learn about projects that are being planned or considered, one of the first things that you're going to face, and people say this is why I hate community meetings, because they always come in stirred and upset. Because they come in stirred and upset because most of the knowledge of their past has been that someone has already said something, made a plan, and then invites them to comment, and then there's nothing ever heard about it. I was pretty struck because I was doing some research, I was trying to do some research on 95 down here, and it was sort of struck me because I know this happens in other places. We had it in Baltimore too. We have a highway that we call the Highway to Nowhere in Baltimore. It was supposed to be a part of I-70. It was going to, the original plan was for basically 70 to rip through the center of downtown, and basically connect from 95 to the other end of the other end of the country. But the first part of the highway that was done was about a 1.5 mile stretch through neighborhoods of West Baltimore, low income, mostly African American people who had been actually part of the block busting movement, after housing desegregation started taking place. But they didn't have a voice, and so the highway were through the neighborhoods. And I think it's really interesting that this is a story. This was a story that was in the Herald in 2013, and this is some of the comments from some of the community members who were impacted by that. And when the highway was built in the 1960s, and this is 40 years later, and this is what somebody's talking about. That he died depressed because he never understood why they had to take his house. He never got over it because someone determined what higher and better value was for a highway system. They were angry because it didn't have to happen. There were several plans on the drawing board, and we didn't have the political support to fight for that. They didn't have voice. And that's one of the things that residents always say that they need to have is a stronger voice in the decisions that are being made. And then to sort of add insult to injury, it was actually designated, putting the highway in was a slum clearance program. And when you tell people that their community is a slum, that the place that they live, the place that they raise their kids, the place that they call home, the place that they actually do business, have business, or trying to grow business, is a slum because it doesn't fit your idea of what it looks like out of your windshield survey. That's sort of an indignity and a blow to their humanity, and that's something we should really be working to change. So there are many ways to be a minority. We can talk about it in racial terms, but here, since we're talking about a transportation conference, I'm going to talk about it in terms of who transportation minorities are. And there are ways that we are indignant to transportation minorities. If you walk, if you bike, we were just having this conversation. If you walk, if you bike, if you ride transit, you are a minority. And in many ways, it is infuriating because you feel as such. It is easier to cut a transit route sort of blindly and somewhat what seems to be blithely, if you're the person who's dependent on transit, to make ways so that you can actually, in certain ways, in doing some of what we claim to do is right, which is fix it first on streets. When we do sidewalks, and it was funny, I drove in here, and because I think about this, because sometimes I do the walk thing too, and I think about that sidewalk, that 4-foot sidewalk that is next to a 4, 6, 8 lane highway, and I often think about it in terms of the day that it's raining, and that is sort of what the person, if you're able to walk, if you're walking, that you have to walk past, and if you're in a wheelchair, imagine negotiating around that pole. That's just the type of thing that is sort of an inequitable form of transportation planning and implementation that people have to live through. Or in the case of the photo on the right side, that's a lady waiting for a bus. No crosswalk, no real way to get there. You are taking your life in your own hand to get there and to make it to that bus stop. So again, one of the things we have to think about as ways to change our equity framework is really to understand it from the perspective of the user. One of the things I've been starting to champion much more is that, and this is what you do when you call public participation processes, but it's really about how do you get the voices of those who are impacted by the decision making at the table before the decisions are actually being made. So, how do we do it better? The devil is in the details. And it was funny, a couple days after the election, I was in Newark, New Jersey, meeting with some folks from smart growth organizations around the country. And there was this, obviously people were in a state about what we were going to do, what we didn't know. But what we did know is that, if we're thinking about the development of policy, my recommendation to them, and actually this is something that Angela Glover-Blackwell, the head of PolicyLink, has written about in a very eloquent statement. I call it developing curb cut policy. And people look at you like, what? What are you talking about? Everybody knows why curb cuts were done, right? First curb cut was done in Berkeley, I think it was, because there were handicapped students at University of Berkeley who couldn't get around on campus. But eventually it became part of the ADA. And, it was basically meant for people in wheelchairs. But curb cuts actually have benefited every aspect of society. If you have a roller bag, you use a curb cut. If you have a stroller, you use a curb cut. If you're a worker carrying catered food, you use a curb cut. But the policy that was created was for the most vulnerable of us. It was correcting an inequity that existed in the world, in the community, in the transportation sector. But the benefit of addressing that inequity for the least among us actually benefited everyone. That is what we're aiming for. Second thing, do away with dad. How many times do you, or have you in your history, and I know folks walk into it every time, if I go back to that highway slide, basically it was, somebody decided to do the highway system, somebody announced that it was going to happen, and in many cases the defense was the lawsuits that had happened. And you wonder why things cost so much, right? Put an end to dad. Do away with dad, get rid of him. What we have found is that if you involve citizens early and often in the process, they are much more likely to be your champions and supporters. If you're, it'll cost you less. You won't have to be worrying about litigation or bad press or anything else like that. But there are also good ways to do it. The one on the left actually talks about a meeting. I was trying to find a better sign, but because I think one of the best things you can do to invite people to a meeting is to have food. You did it here today, and everybody came up and showed up and stayed and even had cookies. But then there's the one on the right, and I'm sorry the circle sort of got misguided. But the one on the right was a meeting that just took place last week, where the meeting began at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, but yet it is a community meeting. You don't want community there. And if you may not be able to see this, but it says that you actually have to register for information on the website if you want it to be legitimate community input. That is not for communities that may not have ready access to the internet, who may not have time, who actually have personal policy issues to worry about, like whether they're going to be able to pay for the heat in their household. That is not an accommodation. That is not an equitable accommodation for folks. So getting rid of DAD, but also doing it in a way that is actually inclusive and make sure that people can show up and participate. In many cases, I know we've done work in East Baltimore for a number of years, and we have done more night meetings, more Saturday meetings than I care to think of. But at the end of the day, while you may start out with some contentious issues, having them involved early on in the process makes a difference. In the first time you do it, especially if you do it early, people have been so accustomed to being forgotten about or walked over or neglected. If you do a process in a different way that is open and transparent, they may not believe you at first, because they have been dulled by the misuse of them and their communities. Equity does not just mean in the design; it also means in the hiring. If you're going through communities and making changes, I know there's the HUD Section 3 rule around housing and local hiring, and we were fighting for years around, and there have been some changes around local hiring and with transportation projects and transit projects, but hiring local is also an important thing. There's probably the next indignity to not being able to get through somewhere is to have it come through your neighborhood and you not to be employed by it, especially if you're a lower income person. So the more you can do to really support economic inclusion practices and policies would be a great thing to creating economic equity in the communities, and that goes a long way toward really creating whole communities as well. So I'm going to close with one last story, and this is one of my favorites because I am a foundation person, so I give away grants. And one of the things I would actually encourage y'all to do, especially if you're thinking about how to do better planning processes, don't ask me, but check in with your local community foundation to see whether they would actually help support the costs of, refreshments and things like that for some of your meetings. And I say this because lots of community foundations, if you don't know the way the community foundation works, there are usually, there are lots of individual donors who throw money into community foundations and have certain areas of interest. And so while the community foundation itself may not have a grant program for this, they may have one of their donor-advised funds that would actually help support some of the efforts that you're thinking about. So for those of you who haven't necessarily worked with community foundations, for those of you folks who are doing the public outreach efforts, I would really recommend that you actually check in with some of the community foundations here in the Tri-County part of the state. But the story I'm going to give you is, so about 10 years ago, we had this grant program at the foundation. It was called Real-Time Community Change. And it really was around residents sort of taking control of their own destiny. And it's pretty unusual because foundations usually don't give grants to individuals. We normally give them to nonprofit organizations or to governments to do things. So, but we had a cohort of folks, and one of the folks, they were concerned because they lived in the neighborhood in East Baltimore. And the kids had to walk to school. And on the walk to school, they had to cross not one but two 4-lane highways. The second one is called Orleans Street, and actually it is not I-40, it is US 40. So it's an arterial running back and forth. And the parents have really been trying to get the school system to provide crossing guards, but the school wouldn't do it. And so they decided that they wanted to get the grant to really organize Parents on Patrol, which their money was spent in buying yellow jackets for the parents, and they would stand at the corners to make sure the kids could get across the school because the city wasn't providing crossing guards. In the year before Parents on Patrol started, 13 kids got hit by a car going to school. Parents on Patrol did their thing for about 6 months. You know, the first grant period was for about 6 months. In that 6 month period, no kids got hit by a car. Because they had that evidence and that data, they went back to the school system and they got crossing guards. That's just a story of how you can actually sort of turn something that is an inequitable situation into an equitable situation, and it doesn't cost a boatload of money to do it. It really takes a group of folks who are really committed to the change, the ability for them to have a part in the process, and then being able to have the tools, the implementation, and the data that actually can demonstrate the results. So there are a couple steps on the pathway to equity for you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I have to tell y'all, I am so mad at you. I really am. I am extremely frustrated. I was so excited about coming here, and I am happy to be here. But it's been raining in California, in Oakland, where I live, for 2 months, right? So I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to the sunshine, and look, it's getting cold and raining. What is up with that? I was looking forward to some Southern hospitality, but yet and still, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, there's a little bit of sun peeking out now, I know, but on the way over here in the Uber, it was raining. I was distraught. So, you know, I don't really feel like there's a whole lot for me to say, right? At this point, these two dynamic speakers before me have really kind of summed it up in terms of why equity is important and why Scott really lifted up why it's important to think about it in a comprehensive nature, not just as you are a service provider and there is the community. So I want a couple of threads that I want to follow up on a little bit. And while other people are talking, I always make a note to myself of things I want to pull out a little bit more that they said, and then I always forget to look at the note. But anyway, I'm going to try to remember. So Policy Link is a national nonprofit organization. We're based in Oakland, California. We're a research and action institute. We work on a wide variety of issues: transportation, housing, land use planning, zoning, access to healthy food. We kind of are a do-it-all shop. The common thread that runs through all our work is access to opportunity for people of color in low-income communities, and that's what we define as equity. So every aspect of our work is really focused on how do we help, make sure that we have a level playing field and that people have the opportunity to be born into and grow up into a society that is just and fair and that allows them to realize their full potential as human beings. We're all born with potential, and some of us get that encouraged and fostered in us, and some of us get discouraged. And we have that potential kind of not ever realize that we may never even realize it because of the messages that we get about ourselves or the neighborhoods that we grow up in, how much money our families have, what kind of schools we go to. And many of those things, I would say all of those things are things that children have no choice over, and we were all a child once. So I just also want to point out that the most recent Secretary of the Department of Transportation, Anthony Fox, who, let's just give Secretary Fox a round. I mean, he was tremendous, innovative. He got local planning and local issues, but because he came from, that kind of role. But anyway, Secretary Fox really has lifted up through these two quotes the real opportunity that transportation, transit, the reason why safe and complete streets are so important is that transportation, like housing, like a job, like a car, which is a part of transportation, are all really tools that people can use to situate themselves in life in a way that helps them access opportunity, right? So when we think about the role of walking, it's to get someplace. Riding a bike, it's to take us to and from someplace. Accessing transit is to be able to connect to opportunity, right? And bring ourselves back home. So it really is something that we use as a tool rather than making it the central focus of what we do, right? How do we make sure everyone has access to the tools that they need in order to be successful in life? And then I just love this part 1 of the AICP Code of Ethics, right, that really talks about government's responsibility to foster equitable communities for all of its residents. Not some, all. Now, I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota originally. I live in Oakland now. And don't tell my folks back in Minneapolis, but I'm really happy to be living in Oakland. So the city was instituting a bike sharing program. And I grew up in North Minneapolis. North Minneapolis is the oldest historical black community in the city. It is the most disinfested, distressed, high crime. You guys have communities like that here. And so the bike sharing program was moving forward, and they put out a map of where they would have all the kiosks and access to the bikes, and were advertising it, and the legend of the program was over my neighborhood. No kiosks there, no, right? It's like we didn't even exist. Or we were so much of a slum, or those people wouldn't want to use a bike sharing program, right? That no thought even went into how do we make sure that this community is served. And had they brought people from the community into the planning process, they would have known that it would have been a really hot spot to put a bike sharing program, because there was a high number of your population of folks who are transit dependent because they don't have access to automobiles. So really thinking about how all of us, on some level or another, are participating in systems that were designed to be exclusive. Now, I know none of us really want this to be the case, but our federal government designed the communities that Scott described that are so-called slums. They designed them to be slums through federal regulations about who could live where based on race. And if you happen to be a really, really, really poor person who wasn't of that race, like if you just happen to be a really, 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 really poor white person who was seen as, right, the bottom of the barrel for whites, you might wind up living in the black neighborhood too. But so we know that these kinds of redlining, Scott talked about redlining, discriminatory practices, excluding African Americans from participating in the paying into Social Security, all those kinds of, discrimination through jobs, education, all those kinds of things have helped create the challenges that we're facing today. So we need to really be rooted in what really happened and why these communities are really the way they are, when we approach the work. Otherwise, we're going to approach it with the wrong attitude and with the wrong kinds of perceptions, and we won't get the benefits that we all want to get out of it. So this is the map that Scott talked about of Baltimore. This is a map that was created using federal government land use and zoning standards, right, and policies. And so you can see where the red line neighborhoods are in the map. And this is a map that shows where all the food, well, not all, but this is a map that shows where the food deserts are in Baltimore today. Well, let's see. Yeah, 2012. Thank you. I have my glasses on, still can't see. And this is a map that shows where the city is not paying attention to street cleaning, where other people feel that they can come and dump, right, rather than pay for proper disposal of garbage. We have a big problem with that in East Oakland. And this map shows you where the vacant and abandoned properties are. And sometimes they're not vacant and abandoned because nobody owns them. They're vacant and abandoned because the people that own them are using them as a tax write-off. They don't live in the community and they don't maintain those properties, right? So these are the kinds of ways that bad neighborhoods are not invested in at the same level as good neighborhoods, and that they're also still predicated on through practices like dumping and like using abandoned properties as tax write-offs and not caring about how you maintain the properties that you may have tenants in those neighborhoods, right? And those are all things that are being done to the community, not the things that the community is doing to itself. So we picked on Baltimore enough, now let's pick on Miami. So this is an old HOLC map of Miami. Who is here from Miami? Okay, don't be mad at me. I didn't do it. I'm just showing you a picture I found. Okay. And so you see from the legend, it's pretty small, and I'm not a great techie person, map maker. But this map actually shows that the grid-looking area is where it's noted as Negro issues, right? So this is where the black people are living. And then this next slide actually shows where the purple outline on your left is racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty today in Miami. It's based on the 2010 census data, but these are your racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty that were pulled out of the HUD Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Data and Mapping tool. That's publicly available to you to use as well. And then I've circled, and my circle looks better than Scott's, ha, 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 ha. Where the Negro considerations were made in the map earlier, the earlier map, the HOLC map. So as you can see, right, these kinds of redlining attitudes, approaches, and lack of investment have carried forward, and we're still playing those out today. So this is also out of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Data and Mapping tool, and it then now is showing you who lives in those neighborhoods that are the racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So I better hurry up here. So these kinds of communities are engineered, they have been created, and they are being exacerbated through policy. And even worse now, if you go back to this map of Miami and you look at where the water is, right? So I would imagine those of you who are local could tell us stories about how some gentrification, and we heard Amiko earlier talking about pushing people out, is now occurring in those communities. Right now, Oakland has the 3rd highest rental market in the nation. In the nation. The white population in Oakland now is higher than the black population. Why? Because people with money who work in high tech and can no longer afford to live in San Francisco said, we want Oakland. And so now those folks who have weathered the storm, there's investment happening, Uber is moving in, they're building a big old complex in downtown Oakland. Yay, we want economic opportunity, but we want it to be shared and inclusive. So I'm just going to hurry up and talk about a little bit about silo busting. I work mostly on federal policy and what the previous administration has done that I hope this next administration or this current administration might consider carrying forward is integrated planning approaches. So Amico and Scott both talked about how you want to make sure, I see some people smirking, but anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But so about how in order to really have complete safe streets, you're going to want to look at the whole experience of the folks who live in the communities. And you can't like study it. You have these slides, so I'm just going to whiz through some of these. These are showing you the kinds of indicators that are in the HUD Exchange data and mapping tool. Hurry up and download the data if you want it, because it might not be there long. But you can look at disparities in access to transportation. You can look at your racially concentrated areas of poverty. You can look at transportation cost index. There's a lot of great information in there for you to be making planning decisions off of that are rooted in looking at the whole life and whole experience of the community. And PolicyLink also has a national equity atlas. Many of you, I think you got a summary of your regional equitable growth profile of Southeast Florida. We did that work to model the development of this atlas, and we've updated the data, so go in there, use it as a resource. And you have a full profile. We just gave you the summary, but there's a full profile that's about 123 indicators, and the report is found on this website. And we also have data in there now on the largest 100 cities. So I'm not gonna walk through all this data because I don't have time, but the pieces that I do wanna get to really before I sit down is talking about inclusive planning processes, right? So getting to complete safe streets without, and Amico and Scott talked about inclusion and engagement. I really want you to go a step further and talk about shared decision making and local inclusive governance, right? People know what they need. They know what the problems are in their communities. And actually communities are a little fed up with being studied, right? They want to be in problem solving in partnership with you. They have great ideas. They don't know the technical terminology maybe, and some of them probably know that too and could teach all of us a few things if we would take the time to listen to them. But we need to see the community as a resource and as a partner, not just as the people that we are serving. We are in service to them. And so when we are in service, we should listen to our leaders tell us how to get our jobs done the very best way. So this slide just depicts a process that is inclusive. It's not going to think about everything, but it might be helpful to you. This is a slide from King County. It talks about their decision-making processes. They have a big focus on equity in King County, and this is the process that they've decided that they're going to implement in every decision that they make. From every budgeting decision, they're going to look at what are the equity outcomes and the equity benefits. The question of who pays, who benefits should always be at the forefront of our minds when we think about the strategies. And then like Scott said, and I just can't emphasize enough, if you participate in a community design planning process and then everybody who shows up to do the work doesn't look like the people who actually live there, how do you think folks feel about that, right? I'm mad about it. So we have to start to think all the way through the process at every juncture. What are the ways that we are actually partnering with community to invest in community, not subsidize it, but fully invest and fully ensure that every decision that we make has a benefit that is central to the community. So I've been told I gotta sit down now, even though I came here in the rain. But, but I just kind of want to leave you with this slide to illustrate the point Scott made about the mistrust. Around this country, it's not just here in Florida. Oh, I meant to tell you guys too, and Miko talked about all the areas where you're number one in data. You're also number one in housing cost burden in the state of Florida and in Southeast Florida. So sorry, but if you wouldn't have asked me to come when it was going to be raining, I might not have told you that. So anyway, this, just really that African-American, vibrant African-American business districts around this country have been decimated in the name of progress and specifically related to transportation. So let's be conscious of that. Let's be careful about how we view the people that we want to serve. And let's make sure that we are walking our talk in every aspect of the work that we do. Thank you very much.
Questions from the floor?
Don't ask me. So it's not an easy issue, but there are ways to combat it. So there are policy tools that you can use when you're thinking about development. You can think about ways to use inclusionary zoning. You can think about ways for cities and counties to actually land bank, acquire property, work in partnership with local affordable housing CDCs and other developers who are interested in ensuring affordability to build more affordable housing and to also retain affordability that's currently in place in areas that are gentrifying. In Oakland, I am so blessed that we have rent control because I would be displaced. That is how maddening it is. Rent control is very hard to pass, but if you start to chip away at it by just going a little at it at a time, you may be able to make some progress with it depending on the kind of political environment that you're working in.
I would just modify to how do we prevent displacement? Because I think what happens, what gentrification usually implies is that that schools get better, that communities' relationship with the police gets better, that housing quality gets better, that property values improve, and that's something that everyone wants. That's something that almost everybody in every community wants. But what happens is that either there are basically two types of gentrification. There is the economic gentrification where you are priced out of a market, but there is also a cultural gentrification where people who were living in the community who had a social norm that existed. Like in Baltimore, people sit on stoops, and they will sit on stoops in the summertime at night because it's hot outside. But yet that conversation and what takes place there is a nuisance, is then perceived as a nuisance to a set of new people. And so a cultural norm is interrupted, it is changed, and people don't feel welcome anymore. And that's another type of gentrification where you just don't feel welcome in the place that you called home anymore. So I understand the market pressures that impact gentrification. But I think there is also something to be said around really being supportive of people who are living in communities so they don't feel like they have to leave their communities in order to feel comfortable being around their own people.
I have to tell you, I think that your presentations were the most compelling presentations that I've heard today.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Because I think that solving complete streets issues is a solvable problem with money. Because I think the will is there to do those things. But I don't know how to answer the questions that you've posed. And I really have to think about that. I do think it was ironic when you talked about people, the cultural part of sitting on the front steps. Mm-hmm. The irony is that we're supposed to build houses now that have porches in the front so we can all sit in the front.
Right, eyes on the street.
So we have learned that. But I want to thank you because that's the most thought-provoking conversation we've had today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question, I think, for Scott. You had a map which showed a large number of properties that were owned by absentee landlords that didn't live in the community, but they owned the property for a tax write-off. Was the government, I forget which one of you, because you both had a lot of maps up there, is the government one of the more predominant landowners of these vacant properties, or is it private owners?
You know, that's a great question, and it's a mix of both. So, and every city is different, so I can speak to the dynamics in Oakland and in Minneapolis. I'll use those as an example. For a bus rapid transit project in Oakland along a boulevard that goes through several areas of concentrated poverty that are primarily concentrated in one area by African Americans and along the same corridor, then Latinos, and a little bit further down, Asian populations. There, we mapped the vacant and abandoned properties, and then we mapped were they privately owned or city owned, and we were shocked to see how many of them were owned by the city of Oakland or by Alameda County, and we also were not surprised at the number that were owned by private investors. So it's a mix. And so one of the strategies that was used in Minneapolis around this land acquisition policy was really to find those private owners that had these vacant and dilapidated and blighted properties and try to buy them from them in order to do affordable housing development.
Yeah, I'd say in Baltimore, probably the city is not the owner of the majority of the properties. However, they have begun, or they have found and used tools much more aggressively to seize control of properties, because obviously what happens is that not only does the vacant property then create a scourge on the street and sort of the street face and danger issues from people entering the buildings, but it also pulls down the value of the other houses in the block. And so what the city has been trying to do is really using all of its acquisition tools at its disposal, including seizure of properties, and then has developed another program called Vacants to Value to try to either to assemble the properties and either put them back on the market for individual rehab, a block group of properties that may be developed by a small or mid-scale developer, or in certainly larger cases where they have whole blocks or near whole blocks, to actually convert the land and put it out for an RFP for redevelopment.
Question here on the right. All right.
Hi, Scot and Sarita. Thank you for coming and joining us today. I really have a comment and maybe a moment of frustration that I would like to vent, so please excuse me. I work for an NPO, and we have grant funding that we are able to allocate out to municipalities that apply. One of the issues that I see is that what seems to happen is a lot of the municipalities who could benefit the most from the funding that we have don't necessarily have the planning staff that are able to allocate their time to that task, and or the citizens that kind of speak up and say what the issues are. So I just kind of want to pose that question, I guess, to the room, if there are any best practices there. We've tried to kind of correct for that in our scoring, so making sure that we represent certain populations in the way that we prioritize who receives funding, but there's still kind of an institutional issue with how we can get more of those projects on the ground.
So I'll just quickly take a stab at it, and I know Scott, the funder, who asking for money, he's nice. You know, so really, congratulations to you all for recognizing the problem and for taking steps in your scoring to address it. One of the things that we have to recognize is that all of the issues that we've talked about that impact those neighborhoods and those communities have made, right, that there's diminished capacity at the technical level or economically to bring in capacity or to build capacity within themselves. So we're all, if we say we want to work in partnership, right, it's just like if we're in a marriage and our spouse says, you know, I'm really struggling with, you know, not eating cheesecake at 3 a.m. while you're sleeping. So can you please not put the cheesecake in the refrigerator, right? Can you either eat it before you come home? And that we don't address that. We somehow don't help our partner have the capacity that they need. So technical assistance in the application process, really understanding exactly why they don't apply, where the rubber hits the road in terms of the challenges of how the applications are completed. Is it in identifying and describing the right kind of projects? Is it having the time to complete the application at all? Is it, right? And so maybe one of the RFPs is about technical assistance provision for those communities, or there's some opportunities to provide some meetings where you go over the applications and that kind of thing, but really providing that technical assistance and capacity building.
Yeah, I would agree on the technical assistance. One of the other, so I've served on a board of a couple of foundations, and one of the ones that we served on, I chaired the committee trying to expand sort of the access to resources. And one of the things we actually took a look at was really our own application process. And you know, whether how we wrote the application, you know, how we developed the application was sort of stretching the bar for where the capacity would be, whether the language was in our you know, in our dialect versus the dialect that is actually out there in the world. You know, I mean, in philanthropy, you know, we do have philanthropy speak, and sometimes we'll just like write things and, you know, with flowery words and that mean nothing to anyone else. And sometimes we have to check I mean, I think there's also an importance in checking ourselves on that aspect of it. We did that for a relocation plan in Baltimore City, and one of the things that we worked on was making the language plain but not simple. And so you know, and the variance being that it was not talking down to people, but it was as was said earlier, meeting them on their level. So and we also reviewed that stuff with the community. And I see we're like running on time.
Last question.
Right here. That's
She's got one.
I got the mic. I got it.
Don't mess with her. Don't mess with her.
I don't have a question, but I do have a statement, and it's how grateful I am to the MPO. Back in the early 80s, the county took a street, made it 6 lanes through a residential neighborhood, no less with 3 major schools there. So we've had a problem with people catching the bus, standing on 2 feet of property, you know, which is very dangerous. So because of my MPO, DOT and all, we have funding, and my Gary Rogers, y'all know Gary, he was awarded today. We will be there going to start doing work to lessen that street so that we have a bike lane and we'll have walking sidewalks.
Awesome.
Congratulations.
So I am truly grateful, Mr. Gregg.
I have one only an observation. I thank you for what you've done. When you use the words affordable and housing, big difference in the area I live. Affordable in Sarasota could be a $1.4 million condo. The difference between affordable and workforce housing is the thing that I really want to.
No, thank you for that proviso. Yes, when we talk normally, the word, trick language, right? Affordable housing, 80% area median income. I have to say that when I work in Baltimore, because in Baltimore, the area median income is 78,000. Median income in Baltimore City is 43,000. Median income in the neighborhoods we work in is around 20,000. Median income in the richest county in the region is around $108,000. So when people talk about doing affordable housing in Baltimore City, it is around $58,000, which means it's not affordable to the average Baltimorean.
Right. That's right.
The absolute last question.
Okay, Sarita, thank you so much, and Scott, for this wonderful presentation. I think it brought a lot of information to us that we really didn't know about. But I'm concerned, the numbers that you're giving us are the figures about the properties that are undeveloped and that are a blight. Is that is that a recent, it's still going on now in this day rather than 2010 or 2014? Because I'm surprised that the local government does not take action on it. If they own the property, they should be cleaning it up. And if it belongs to others, I believe there might be some sort of a fine that these other property holders can be, held accountable. And I think the community has to have a very loud voice to make sure it's done, and perhaps through their councilman or their commissioner, this really is not acceptable in this day and age. So hope that you will be able to reach out to the local government and see what can be done. And as I said, somebody has to be a voice for the community. And I thank you so much for bringing this to our attention.
Hear, hear.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Sarita Turner and Scott Spencer.
Thank you.